Thanks for listening to the New Liberal podcast. This week we are sharing an episode that until now was an exclusive bonus episode for members and supporters of the Center for New Liberalism. If you want to make sure that you hear every episode, you can join up by going to patreon.com/newliberalpodcast, or you can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Our members are what makes the podcast possible and what makes the entire Center for New Liberalism possible. Thank you so much to all of our members, and if you haven't joined up yet, do so today. That's cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and this episode is a books episode. We're reviewing the best books I've read this year so far, 2024. We do this in two parts. This is part one, our first books episode of 2024. We're halfway through the year. I've read about 15 books so far this year, and we're going to be reviewing them. What have I liked? What have I not liked? We'll do this again at the end of 2024, recapping the best books for the entire year. But, I read a lot of fiction, a lot of nonfiction. I try to stay current on, what are some of the big debates happening out there in the policy space, what's happening out there in the discourse. And, some of it's very good, some of it's not. So let's jump into what I've been reading, what I would recommend, and what I would tell you to steer clear of. As is normal with these books episodes, I'm going to start out with my least favorite book. We're going to get that out of the way first. The worst book that I've read so far in 2024 is Filter World by Kyle Chayka. Filter World is subtitled How Algorithms Flattened Culture, and it's a book about algorithms and social media. I actually think it's got a great premise, which is why I picked it up and read it. What are the algorithms that shape social media and the internet that we use every day? How do they work? How are these algorithms influencing our behavior, our culture, our politics? I'm into that. That sounds like a great premise. I picked it up. I was excited to read the book. But Filter World ends up as this kind of oddly preachy, judgy book that isn't actually very curious about the subject of the algorithms that they're claiming to explore. It's one of those books that's good at identifying that a trend is happening. Algorithmic thing. Everything is controlled by algorithms now. Well, yes. But it didn't have much interesting to say about that after, beyond just identifying the trend. So let's jump into just a little bit of where it falls short. It starts out strong. It's got, a little bit of history. It kind of gives us the history of algorithms. Starts all the way at the very beginning where they talk about the scholar Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, who, his last name, Khwarizmi, turns from al-Khwarizmi to algorithmi, and algorithm. It's the guy from whom we get the word algorithm, which came from, the Islamic Golden Age into Europe. And it tracks the history of computers from Ada Lovelace to Turing, the very first algorithms and recommendation systems online. It talks about like early Google, early Facebook, PageRank, and kind of the birth of the modern algorithm on the internet. And all of that is good. But things kind of go downhill after that. It starts to kind of talk about modern algorithms and how they're used on websites like Amazon and Netflix and Spotify and other large websites. And the author's thesis is that algorithms are massively influencing what we buy, what books we buy, what fashion becomes trendy, what movies and TV we consume. And obviously that's true. Obviously the algorithms are influential, but there's no real insight as like, well, why were they implemented in the first place? Okay, if the author is decrying all this, and he is, why are people doing this? Why are they necessary? The algorithms suck, according to this guy, but then why do we use them all the time? And he seems to kind of just lean on like some sort of weird evil corporation answer. But I don't know, it just seemed very incurious to me. The problem, as I see it, which the book never talks about, is that you've got to put something on your front page. That, what is the alternative? Your Spotify, you've got to recommend people new music somehow. There's going to be some sort of system for doing that, and the algorithm is what they came up with. How does Amazon decide which products go on the front page? When you log in, should it just be alphabetically, or do they need an algorithm of some kind? With social media, you can say, well, people just want a chronological feed. But the thing is, that's demonstrably not true. You can offer them the choice of just a chronological feed as opposed to like a For You tab that's algorithmically generated. And people will choose the For You tab because it has better results and they spend more time on it. And they use the website more. And I don't know. It doesn't reckon at all with the fact that algorithms are actually very useful and that people choose them. They opt in to algorithms in tons and tons of situations. It also has a weird section that's like the author getting upset about some weird niche bullshit stuff. It's like just the author cares about it. I think about 10% of the book is spent on the problem of coffee shop aesthetics and how all coffee shops look the same now because they're all optimizing for Instagram. And like the author is this jet-setting, globe-hopping kind of person who's very upset that the coffee shops in Bucharest, Romania look the same as the coffee shops in South Africa and Tokyo and Brooklyn. And I'm like, dude, this is a problem that nobody cares about. Nobody but you cares about this. Like, why is 10% of your book about coffee shops? So ultimately, just a disappointing book. Again, the word I would use is incurious. It identifies something interesting happening in the culture. Algorithms are dictating more and more stuff, but then it just has so little of any insight to say, other than just a sort of vague, this thing is bad, big tech bad, like vibes-based stuff. So I cannot recommend, unfortunately, Filter World by Kyle Chayka. All right, now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about some of the books that I did think were interesting this year, interesting and potentially worthwhile. The way we normally break this down is I read a lot of nonfiction, a lot of more academic stuff. I typically read some fiction as well. And then I try to talk about the very best books of either category. So what we'll do is we'll talk about some of the nonfiction. We'll take a little bit of an interlude to talk about the fiction that I read. We'll finish up the nonfiction section. And at the end of the episode, we'll get to my top 3, the best 3 books that I've read so far this year. But kicking off our nonfiction section, I want to talk about a book called After the End of History by Francis Fukuyama. Now, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama is an incredibly worthwhile book. It's historically relevant. It's one of Fukuyama's great works. Fukuyama is obviously this, great political scientist, this great political theorist, and The End of History is one of his masterworks. It's often misunderstood because the title, The End of History, is a very provocative title, and people all the time will say, no, well, it turns out history didn't really end, did it? And that's very silly. He means something specific by the end of history, and we're not going to get into that here. But if you are somebody who's already interested in Fukuyama and who already knows his ideas and appreciates him, After the End of History is essentially a set of conversations. It's essentially a book-length interview. The format of the book is not that Fukuyama really wrote this book, but that someone else interviewed him extensively about his ideas 20 years after his kind of groundbreaking seminal work. The book is edited by Matilda Fasting, and essentially Matilda is just interviewing Fukuyama about his ideas, about, there's a series of kind of ideas present in the famous book, The End of History and the Last Man. And there's a lot of stuff that's happened in the world since that book was released and since the impact that book had that has, supported the book's thesis, some of it that has gone against the book's thesis, I would say. It dives into topics like the rise of Donald Trump, the rise of China, the rise of kind of this authoritarian right-wing movement all over the globe. And it talks about, how the book's arguments, the end of history's arguments, have held up over, the last 20 to 30 years. Really just a very interesting set of conversations, an author reflecting on their own work. This one I would recommend if you are already interested in Fukuyama's work. If you're already familiar with him, if you've read him before, After the End of History will provide you more insight and more depth into how he really thinks, how he really approaches problems like this. It's more informal. It's him kind of in a conversational tone discussing this kind of stuff. It's wide-ranging. It talks about all sorts of stuff from the abstract theorization to very concrete, on-the-ground, news-oriented stuff. But this one I would recommend not for just everyone, but for specifically people who are already quite interested in Fukuyama's work. The book is After the End of History, edited by Matilda Fasting, Francis Fukuyama. The next book we'll talk about is The Wager by David Grann. David Grann is somewhat of a well-known author. Recently, anyway, he is the guy who wrote the book Killers of the Flower Moon, which you may know was turned into a big Oscar-nominated movie with directed by Martin Scorsese, and it had Leo DiCaprio and stuff. It was big production. And so David Grann is the guy who wrote the book that's based off of Killers of the Flower Moon. He writes these kind of historical epics where he's writing about real things that happened, but he tells it in a very gripping kind of narrative way. So it's a nonfiction book. It's not a fictional narrative, it's historical, but his writing is so good that you almost feel like you're reading a fictional narrative. You feel like he's just writing this and inventing it, even though he's not. I'm praising the quality of his prose, I guess. Now, The Wager is subtitled A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder. And the book focuses on a ship called The Wager. The Wager is not about a specific bet. It's about a ship called The Wager. And it specifically focuses on a mutiny that happened on this book. The book is about the HMS Wager, which was a book that tried to go around, I believe, the tip of South America in something like 1740, 1741, back when that was, Europe is at war, or at least Britain is at war with Spain. And this is part of the naval warfare that's happening between England and Spain, is that they're trying to track down these Spanish ships, and they're trying to assert naval dominance over the, both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And there's all this stuff happening. But essentially, it is a time in which it is very, very dangerous to try to go around South America, to try to go dip below the tip of South America, below Chile and Argentina, via the Strait of Magellan. And it's just a very, very difficult thing. And as the book accounts, some of the ships make it in this armada, and some of them don't. And The Wager is the one that ends up shipwrecked. And it's a very interesting and gripping story. I have a lot of praise for how David Grann writes. He's just a very engaging writer, and stuff that you might think is really dry, like, oh, how were the men organized? How did they spend their days? What was the discipline structure like? What was the physical structure of the ship like? How did they move around the ship? For some reason, just his style of writing makes it like really, really interesting to read about stuff that otherwise would be really dry. book itself is recounting an incident that I think is pretty interesting. The shipwreck is just the first of the things that happens. It recounts what happens after the shipwreck, how the surviving men try to set up a little society and try to figure out, like, what do we do? How do we get out of this? We're shipwrecked in this barren, remote area of like Argentina, and it's 1740. How are we going to survive? And not to spoil everything, but the book is written because many of them do survive and get to give their accounts. Many of them end up making it back to England. I won't spoil for you how it happens, but even once they make it back, there is drama because mutiny and murder are involved. At some points, the men start to question their leaders. At some points, the leaders have been so pig-headed that men start to think, are the leaders the reason that this shipwreck happened? All of it is really, really fascinating. And I would recommend this book if you're interested in kind of the age of exploration, if you're interested in old naval battles and old naval command, and just kind of these kind of dramatic retellings of stories from history. The Wager by David Grann, definitely worth your time. The next book we will talk about is The Dilemma of an Indian Liberal by Gurcharan Das. Now, this is basically what it says on the label. The Dilemma of an Indian Liberal is about liberalism in India from one of India's foremost current liberal thinkers. Gurcharan Das is someone who's written a lot of books about India. He's written books like, I think, The Elephant Paradigm, which is about the Indian economy, India Grows at Night, The Difficulty of Being Good. So he's a prolific author and Indian thinker, and he felt compelled to basically write a book about liberalism in India and how it applies to India, how liberal ideas have either shaped India and how they could shape India in the future, because India is not necessarily a very liberal place these days. I think he's troubled by the direction that he sees in India. The traditional left-leaning parties are quite socialist and quite statist, and he talks about the history of that in India, that that there's the famous license Raj, where you would have to have a license to do anything. He talks about one of his formative experiences was that he worked for the company that made Vicks VapoRub in India, and there was basically a great wave of sickness. I don't want to say not a plague, but what's the right word? Just a wave of fever hit the country, a really, really powerful flu wave, let's say. And they basically sold out of all Vicks VapoRub, and he kind of worked a bunch of miracles and managed to get a bunch more produced and import some more, and they sold a lot more than regular through his efforts. And for that, he was actually dragged in front of Indian bureaucrats because they had exceeded their quota. They were only allowed to sell a certain amount of Vicks VapoRub in a given year. And because there was this enormous wave of sickness, this enormous flu wave, they exceeded their quota. And the bureaucrat was saying, we might throw you in jail because you violated the rules here. You violated the law. And number one, you get the sense, like, what a bizarre economy where something as mundane as Vicks VapoRub has a quota for how much you can sell. And so, this was kind of a radicalizing thing for him. He ended up not being thrown in jail, but it was a live possibility that he could have been. And it kind of turned him from somebody who supported the kind of current setup, who supported the socialist, left-leaning part of India, into a liberal. And he's troubled by India's history there, and he's glad that India has liberalized since then. Their economy has, in many ways, opened up, and they've started to really take economic growth seriously. It's been very beneficial for them. But he's also troubled by the current rise of right-wing nationalism. He looks at what's happening with Modi, who's the current prime minister of India, and he's troubled by Modi's appeals to kind of Hindu chauvinism and nationalism, and trying to scapegoat or turn Muslim Indians into the others, into the hated enemy. And so he doesn't want any part of that either. And he finds India in a pretty tough place. He thinks there's no good Indian liberal party. And the book is about that. It's about that central dilemma. And, he believes that India really can be a liberal society. He thinks there are many things about India that are set up such that liberalism could flourish. He thinks, Hinduism is a religion with, millions of gods or whatever, a billion people and a billion different individual gods. I don't know what the saying is, but Hinduism has that side. And he thinks that could, there's no reason Hindus shouldn't be religiously tolerant because of that, because, they already tolerate so many other individual gods. And that he goes through different arguments. He talks about Indian thinkers like Gandhi. He talks about Indian thinkers like Amartya Sen, and how Indians have made contributions to liberal thought already. They don't just have to pull from a bunch of dead white Europeans to import their philosophy. He thinks Indians have important contributions to make to the theories of liberalism as well. And the book is about, number one, describing why that's important. And it's kind of a plea as well. Please let this happen, because this is what India needs. Ultimately, a pretty good book. I would say this is one that, if you're interested in the abstract philosophy of liberalism, this may be a little bit more up your alley. If you're interested in India, obviously, then you might be interested here. It perhaps is not for everyone. This would not be like a universal recommendation. But if you're interested in the philosophy of how liberalism can be brought to different countries, if you're interested in India, then consider checking out The Dilemma of an Indian Liberal by Gurcharan Das. All right, let's take a little break from all this serious stuff, all these serious nonfiction books that tackle very serious problems in the world. Let's talk about fiction for just a hot minute. I've read not as much fiction as I normally do this year. I've actually read very little web fiction this year. For the first time in many of these books episodes, I do not have any web serials to recommend. I've not been reading any new web serials. If you want to go listen to previous book episodes, we talk about kind of some of the online stories that I read. But I did read a little bit of fiction this year, less than normal, but a little bit. And let's talk about a few of the things that I read. Some of them a little disappointing or just a little bit mixed, but let's jump in. So the first fictional novel that I'll talk about this year is The Guest Lecture by Martin Riker. The Guest Lecture is about an academic. It's essentially got a protagonist named Abby, who is this economist, and Abby has been, I believe she's been denied tenure, and she's kind of adrift. She's not sure what to do with her life, and she goes to give this guest lecture at some institution about John Maynard Keynes. She is a scholar who has researched John Maynard Keynes. That's one of her research topics. I believe it's specifically supposed to be about his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. That's famously the one where he said, I think the people may only end up working 15 hours a day or something like that. And so this was recommended to me by my wife. She enjoyed it. And she was like, look, it's a novel, and it's got kind of some feminist themes, and it's about an economist. It talks about Keynes. And so you read it, and much of the novel takes place over the course of one night. She's in her hotel room the night before the guest lecture. She's traveled to this place. She's giving the lecture on Keynes. She's trying to remember her notes and how she's going to give the lecture. And Keynes pops up as a character. Keynes pops into her memory and has discussions with her about his ideas and about what's going on in her life. It's like Keynes is her little angel on the shoulder, angel and devil on the shoulder, so to speak. But she has these kind of entertaining conversations with John Maynard Keynes himself. Now, this was kind of a mixed book for me. it's very much the point of the book is about Abby's journey more so than it is about the economics of the stuff. This is a fictional novel where really what they're trying to communicate is that Abby is on a personal journey of self-discovery and needs to discover things about herself. They do end up talking about economics a lot. And because I know so much about Keynes and about economics, I won't say it was horrible, but it was very much like somebody who's obviously an English major or an English professor, like trying to interpret what they think economics is. It was not the way an economist would have written an economist. It was the way an English major tries to interpret what economics is. And so a lot of it is like, oh, well, she's a feminist economist, which means that blah, 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 blah. Like, there's nothing wrong with being a feminist and an economist at the same time. But like, I don't know. It's just, it was a little bit uncanny valley, and that the author clearly didn't actually get to what economists do. And now is that actually important, in the larger theme of like Abby's journey of self-discovery and trying to overcome her personal issues and emerge on the other side a better person? Maybe not, but it was one of those things that bugged me individually. I actually think that I was so close to the subject that I might have been the wrong audience for this book. But because of that, I didn't enjoy it fully, but I can recognize that this was a book that I think it's well written, at least. It's a book that is trying to make some points about society as well. And to be honest, it does get a little bit heavy-handed there. And I don't know. I think I'm probably just too close to the actual material of economics to have appreciated what the author is trying to do. So I'm kind of giving this not a good or a bad review, but just kind of a meh. Like, I don't know if I'm the right person for this. I don't know if I'm the right audience for it. Theoretically, I would be like directly in the audience for it, but I actually think I'm so central to what's going on that I can't appreciate it in the end. So kind of an incomplete, kind of meh, kind of review for The Guest Lecture by Martin Riker. I had a similar sort of feeling for the next book I want to talk about, which is Metro 2033. Now, this book is originally a Russian science fiction book. It inspired a pretty famous series of video games, I think, the Metro 2033 video games. Those games are like bestsellers, and they are, take place in this kind of post-apocalyptic wasteland. And the book is a very interesting setup. Like a lot of science fiction books, it has a really, really interesting, fascinating world to explore, I think. The premise of the book is this. The main character lives in the subway system, the metro of Moscow, Russia, as does everyone else in the world, at least that he's aware of. As far as he is aware, this person who lives in Moscow's subway system, the entire world is dead. There has been a nuclear apocalypse. Something happened, and we're never given really details, but something happened, and the entire world died. And basically, as far as anyone in the Moscow subway station knows, the only survivors in the world are people who are in the Moscow subway system. And they've got this little society. It's 15 or 20 years post-apocalypse. And a little society of a few thousand people or a few 10,000 people or whatever the amount is have survived in the subway system. They grow mushrooms and a few other small crops that allow them to kind of survive. And that's the entire world. The entire world in 2033 is in the metro system of Moscow, and all the tunnels and all the connections. That's what's left of humanity. So that's why it's called Metro 2033. And basically, the book explores what's going on. There's all these weird threats from outside, in addition to it being the apocalypse. Like, there's like these mysterious forces that may or may not be hurting people in the metro, that may or may not be coming from the apocalyptic wasteland that is the rest of the earth. and the protagonist has to explore that. They have to go on a journey. They have to, it's funny. The metro is not even a unified thing. There are like at different subway stations, different gangs basically control it. There's a communist gang, because of course there is. It's Russia. There's a neo-Nazi gang that controls a different part of the subway. There's like a more democratic, normal set of people that controls a different set of the subway. There's, the library, which is like they've tried to like bring down a bunch of books from the outside. There's all these different things. The world itself of the metro, of the Moscow subway system, is really, really interesting. I thought that was by far the strongest part of the book. The story is interesting as well, but the world is really richly imagined, and I really enjoyed kind of diving into that. One thing that stopped me from kind of enjoying it all the way is that, and there's no easy way to say this, you can tell the writing was translated from Russian. And I'm just not sure it was a great translation. There's many points where the writing just feels very awkward. The actual prose, the text itself feels like I'm stumbling over the text, and things are always very awkwardly phrased. And despite the world being interesting, it was a little bit like, I can just tell this was like badly phrased or something. And I think it's just a function of like, this was originally written in Russian. The author's name is Dmitry Glukovsky, and I don't know, that was a little bit of a stumbling block for me in terms of my enjoyment. I still finished the book and I still enjoyed it somewhat, but if I'm just being totally honest, that was something that I noticed. I don't think the translation into English was as good as it could have been. So, a good but nuanced review there, I would say, for Metro 2033 by Dmitry Glukovsky. If you like science fiction, if you specifically like post-apocalyptic science fiction, then consider giving that a shot. Let's talk about one more that I have in the kind of fiction or science fiction fantasy category, and that one is Ink Blood Sister Scribe. Ink Blood Sister Scribe is a novel by Emma Torres. It is in the kind of more realistic form of fantasy. It's a fantasy novel, I would say, but set in our world. It's set on Earth, not on some Lord of the Rings or other fantastical universe. It's set in this world, but the premise is that there are books with real magical power in this world, and there are a select number of people who are able to sense them and operate them. And these books have actual magic, and there's a house in Vermont where one of the main characters has collected several hundred of the books and basically tries to protect them. Some of the books can make you float. Some of the books can set up a ward around your house so you will never be noticed, a protection ward. Some of the books might allow you to sing more beautifully. Some of them might cause you to lose all your hair and your skin to be shriveled. It's all kinds of stuff, standard magic. But that is the world that's set up. Basically equivalent to modern day America and Europe and wherever else is where it takes place for the most part, but with magical books and a select number of people who keep the existence of these books is mostly secret, but there's a select number of people who are able to know about them and sense them and operate them. The book centers around two sisters who are estranged from each other. As the book opens, one of them is at their family home in Vermont, having taken on the task of protecting the family heirlooms, several hundred books that her father collected before he died. And these books are magical, and it's her job to keep them safe and protect them from the outside world and make sure that they don't fall into the wrong hands. Her sister is somewhat estranged, is living in Antarctica at the beginning of the book. Her sister also knows about the magical books, but for mysterious reasons that are not yet explained, has chosen to flee. She didn't tell anyone why she was fleeing, but she left home and has not returned since she was 18 years old. And she's currently living in Antarctica as a research scientist. And she just moves around all the time. And at the beginning of the book, it's not clear why. And basically, things develop from there. A secret is revealed. Characters are revealed to be in danger from this secret. We may end up having to use the books and their powers in order to kind of thwart some of the things that are happening. People are revealed to be after the books. Relationships are more tangled than they seem. I thought Inkblood Sister Scribe was very, very strong. I don't want to reveal too many of the plot details because the book is very heavy on plot. It's hard to say too much without just giving away the game. But Inkblood Sister Scribe was, number one, very well written. It was one of those books that you feel like you're reading it and you look down and it feels like no time has passed, but you notice 70 pages are gone. And you're like, it feels like I've been reading for 15 minutes, I just burned through that. I sped through that so easily. And I think that's just the quality of the writing itself is high. The book is a page turner, I would say, in a way that not every book is. And the world is interesting. Again, it's a relatable world. It's basically the world we live in. But the context of, you learn a little bit about how these books are made. They're not just written like any other book. They have to be specifically manufactured in a specific way. Only certain people with certain abilities can make a magical book. They have to be protected in a certain way. They have to be used in a certain way. But if you follow kind of the guidelines and the rules of the universe, the books do actually give an enormous amount of power in some ways. And then how do you get around those powers if people are trying to use them against you? Really, really fascinating stuff going on. The characters are interesting. The plot is interesting. I would recommend, this is probably the best fictional book I've read this year, Inkblood Sister Scribe. All right, so let's jump back into the nonfiction. I've got a few more nonfiction books to throw at you, and then we're going to get to the top three, the three best books I've read for the entire year of any kind. But before we get to those top three, the first book I want to talk about now is The Hollow Parties. The Hollow Parties is by Daniel Schlossman and Sam Rosenfeld, and it's subtitled The Many Pasts and Disordered Present of American Party Politics. And essentially, the thesis of The Hollow Parties is that America's political parties are hollow shells of what they could be. They are not actually very powerful as organizations in and of themselves. Individual Democratic politicians can obviously be super, super powerful. Joe Biden has a lot of power. He's the president of the United States. Donald Trump has a lot of power because he is the leader of the GOP right now. He's their presidential candidate. Activist groups can be very powerful. They can exert enormous influence over politicians and over the public. But the actual parties themselves, the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee, and the people who actually make up the party infrastructure, they used to be really, really powerful in America. People used to joke about the smoke-filled rooms where a bunch of, party operatives would get together and just kind of decide what was going to happen. A bunch of Democratic bigwigs would all get together in the back of the smoke-filled room, secret, away from the public, and they would decide who was going to be nominated for president. And they would decide what the policies were going to be. And that just doesn't happen anymore. We don't have power players like that anymore. The rise of kind of mass party politics and mass media has taken that away. And these authors actually think that's a bad thing in many, many ways, that has had really detrimental effects on American politics. I thought this was an interesting and valuable book. It's very dry, I will say. It's definitely written by two academics. And so it's not as much of a page turner as some of the other ones that we're going to talk about. It's a little bit more academic and dry in tone. But it is a insightful book and a valuable one for this moment, I would say. At the current moment, we're at a moment right now where a lot of Democrats are concerned about Joe Biden being in the presidential race, for instance. He had a very, very poor first debate. And his campaign had kind of been saying, look, maybe the campaign is struggling a bit, but wait for the first debate. You'll see. We're going to turn things around. Biden's going to go get him. And he had an awful debate. He looked really old. He looked bad. There's a lot of people questioning on the Democratic side now whether he should drop out or not. But the central premise of this book is that there's nobody that can force him to. There is no set of party power brokers, the men in a smoke-filled room that can force him to do it. The parties are actually powerless to do anything. Some people are like, they shouldn't have let Biden. The point of the book is there is no they. When you say they shouldn't have let Biden run again, who? There is no they. Who's they that shouldn't have let him do it? There's nobody there to stop him. In the same way that, Donald Trump essentially took over the GOP because the GOP was institutionally very, very weak. He came in this as this popular outsider, and, he just took over the whole party. And this would never have happened in the 60s. They would have told him to go pound sand, screw off. We don't like you. I don't care if you're getting 25% of our vote, which, initially, if you think about the 2016 primary, there's a lot of people out there. There's Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, there's all sorts of names are tossed into the hat. John Kasich, Jeb Bush. Initially, Donald Trump was winning with like 20 to 25% of the vote in a highly fragmented field. Back in the day, the party bosses would have all just said, okay, well, we don't like this Trump character, so we're all going to support this one guy instead. There would have been a decision made by a bunch of leaders, and everybody would have followed it. And the point is that just doesn't happen anymore because the actual organizations are powerless now. And so you see something similar happening with Joe Biden. Nobody can make him drop out because there's no leadership. There's just the power of individual politicians as opposed to the parties. The book talks about that problem and talks about, how it used to be and how it is now, and how this kind of hollowness of the parties lies at the heart of our current polarization and age of discontent, according to the authors. I would say this is, again, it's a pretty dry book, but a valuable one for the current moment. And so I would recommend it if you're interested in this kind of political science topic. The book, one more time, is The Hollow Parties by Daniel Schlossman and Sam Rosenfeld. The next book we'll talk about is called Napoleon's Buttons by Penny Lecouture and Jay Burrison. Napoleon's Buttons is subtitled How 17 Molecules Changed History. It really has nothing to do with Napoleon or buttons at all. It's a very weird title for a book that I enjoyed anyway. That would be my first, one of my only complaints about the book is, why the hell did you name it Napoleon's Buttons? So the book, which is not related to Napoleon, again, in any way, mostly, the book basically tries to take a bunch of very common chemical compounds or molecules or substances and talk about how they altered the course of history. It's a book both about chemistry and about history. So, for instance, one chapter might be titled Nitro, and it's a chapter about how nitrogen and different nitro substances were invented, and both the cellular structure, the molecular structure, I guess, of those compounds, how they were discovered and how they were used and altered the world, how like gunpowder and explosives changed things, and also how the explosive chemistry changed the course of history, and dynamite and nitrogen being used in fertilizers, how this altered the course of war. It's fascinating stuff. There's a chapter about peppers, nutmegs, and cloves, and how the chemicals inside these, nutmegs and cloves are what makes them valuable and important. It makes them smell a certain way. It gives them certain health properties. It, helps them preserve food, for different things, and how all of that drove the spice trade, and how really it was the rise of these chemicals that was really important. Talks about salt. It talks about morphine, caffeine, phenol, silk and nylon, the rise of plastics, the rise of certain drugs, the pill, chlorocarbon compounds, isoprene, glucose, All these really, really different, some of these very basic chemical building blocks of what makes our world, how these chemical building blocks were first discovered and how they were started to be mass produced and how they altered the course of history. The Napoleon's buttons things, I think, came from some old tale about like, oh, Napoleon's buttons were made out of some specific, the armies of Napoleon had some specific kind of button that ended up being not a very good button. And so they got, their coats didn't fasten very well in the winter. And so they all got frostbite and died. And so really it's an old wives' tale about how even the most, the littlest thing in an army, the buttons that you use is still very important. You've got to be detail oriented. And they use it as like an introduction of like the substances things are made out of are indeed very important. They don't actually go on to talk about Napoleon's buttons at all in the book. But I enjoyed this because I enjoy this kind of book where every chapter is kind of a different thing. And every chapter here jumps to a new substance, whether they're talking about salt, whether they're talking about the discovery of the pill, the birth control pill, whether they're talking about the discovery of fertilizers and the compounds there, or, just whatever it may be. Every chapter is a sort of 20 to 30 page exploration of how a particular chemical compound ended up changing our world. To me, I love that. I love reading history and how it's influenced by things like that. So this was, I thought, a really good book. Anybody who's interested in kind of these historical tales of like, how did a scientific discovery impact the course of history? Strongly recommend Napoleon's Buttons by Penny Locouture and Jay Burrison. And the final nonfiction book I will talk about before we get to our top 3 books, which are also nonfiction, but I'm grouping them separately. They're the top 3. They're special. The final nonfiction book I will talk about before we get to that, though, is a book called The Modem World. The Modem World is by Kevin Driscoll. Its subtitle is A Prehistory of Social Media, because the internet is a very social place, right? We chat with family, we do video chats, we watch live streams, we have parasocial relationships, we debate politics with strangers. But how did the internet turn social, and how did that work in the very, very early days of the internet? Technically, this book is about the stuff that happened even before the internet existed. The internet is not just any time a computer connects to another computer, right? It's actually, in a real technical sense, the internet should refer to, the capital I internet refers to the www dot protocol. The World Wide Web is really what we're talking about here. You could use like lowercase I. There have been many internets in the past. And one of those precursors to what we think of as the capital I internet is the history of what we call bulletin board systems. Bulletin board systems were bulletin board systems, or BBSs, as I'll call them, were these like homebrewed kind of hobbyist ways to connect with people in your local area that were maintained by like computer hobbyists in the early 1980s, even stretching back into the late 1970s. And they were, initially like curiosities that people just spun up because they could. But they ended up having a very interesting history of community. So like, to explain just a little bit, a BBS is something that you used to be able to call into with your actual physical landline phone. If you are a terminally online young person who has no idea what a landline phone is, you used to have a phone that was literally connected to a wire in the ground that would call other people. That's how it used to work, right? And it turns out you could use this phone not just for voice calls, but you could call a computer as well and send data over the phone line. And this was how the very, very first online connections worked. You would actually pick up your phone and use what's called a modem, a modulator, demodulator, to turn phone signals into computer data that could be read by another modem. And that's what they called the modem world, the author Kevin Driscoll. You would instruct your modem to call a specific phone number, and it could download data from that other modem on the other end. So what you would see when you actually called into, got your phone and you called with your modem over the physical landline phone to this computer system was very, very basic. There was no imagery. There was no images of any kind. It was plain text files with no color. The storage space on these things was minuscule, but you could do a couple things on these BBS systems. If you called into this BBS system, you could download files from it, you could read it, and crucially, you could also write to it. The read-write feature was the killer community feature of the time. It featured literally kind of a public bulletin board where anybody could write a new little segment on the bulletin board and say, hey, my name is blah, blah, blah. I am calling in from blah, blah, blah. How is everyone else today? And then somebody else could call in a few hours later and read what they had written and write a response. And again, the storage space on these things was awful. When you got to the end of the storage space, it would just write over the messages. And so these were never lasted for very long. But that was basically some of the very, very first ever peer-to-peer networked communities. And these communities built themselves up over time as phone lines got faster and modems got faster and capable of holding more data and connections got faster. You could store more text, you could store more stuff, and more people started connecting to these, and they started to form real communities in the modem world on these bulletin board systems. And the book is about the history of that, how these communities formed, how they kind of actually became very, very prominent in kind of the pre-internet world in the 1980s, to the point where, at some points, people didn't ask, when they first started asking surveys, for instance, for like the census, the surveys initially didn't say, do you use the internet? They would say stuff like, do you use bulletin board systems on your computer? Only in like 1993 or 1994 did they start to actually ask, do you use the internet? Before that, they mostly talked about like bulletin board systems or maybe like Usenet or something, which was another pre-internet thing. But the book is about the history of the communities that came out of that and how they kind of developed and had a golden age where people really loved this stuff and people were setting up their own servers. And then it ultimately went into decline as the mainstream internet, the World Wide Web, took off in 1995 and just obliterated the bulletin board systems. They were left behind technologically. But it's an interesting book. It's something I'm super, super interested in because, I write a Substack called Infinite Scroll, which is about social media and how we behave socially on the internet. I'm fascinated by people first and foremost, and how people behave on the internet, because they behave in such strange ways. And this was a really interesting look at, what were online communities like in their very, very earliest iterations. So for me, I love this book. I don't know that it would be as fascinating to everyone else, but it was right up my alley. And it kind of gets an honorable mention. It's just outside the top 3. If I probably had to pick a 4th best book that I read this year, it would be this one. It's just so many of the things that we think about when we think about using the internet were pioneered in this system. If you're on like a Discord or a Slack, why do they have different channels for discussing different topics? That comes from bulletin board systems. Why do we have handles, usernames that persist for our many posts? That was something that was, anonymous handles were first used on BBSs. Avatars and ASCII text art and emojis and media piracy on the internet and direct messaging and, crowdfunding of a free-to-use product and, the internet lingo that we know and having to deal with community moderation. And all of this kind of stuff that we think about as very modern internet problems were pioneered on bulletin board communities, BBS communities. So that I enjoyed the book a lot. It's not a perfect book. There are things, where it should have explored more, like it should have explored like ARPANET and Usenet a little bit more. But I really enjoyed it. One more time, that book is The Modem World, A Prehistory of Social Media by Kevin Driscoll. And with that, we get to our top 3 books of the episode. These are the 3 best books that I have read so far in 2024. So the book that comes in at number 3 is Not the End of the World by Hannah Ritchie. This is a book about climate change and about the environment and how to build a sustainable planet from the point of view of an optimist. Hannah Ritchie is someone who works for Our World in Data, which is an organization I absolutely love. I think they do fantastic work. And basically, this is a book about how to think about environmentalism and climate change and, plastic in the ocean and pollution in the air and, all these kind of big environmental problems, the ongoing extinctions that we face and deforestation, all of these problems from the point of view of someone who is what I would call a realistic optimist. Hannah Ritchie believes, obviously, that climate change is a real problem and that it's going to cause a lot of human suffering, but she also thinks that we can overcome that we can actually stop climate change, that it's not going to be a runaway problem that kills everyone. There's a lot of narrative out there that, half of the youngest generation thinks that they will personally die from climate change. And that's just absurd. It almost makes it harder to take action when someone is that much of a doomer. There's a lot of doom-focused narratives out there that are not helpful, and they're not true. I would say, number one, they're not helpful, but almost more importantly, they're just not accurate. And so Hannah Ritchie basically has a very data-driven, focused approach to what are the problems that we're facing with the environment. And it's not just climate change. She has a chapter on deforestation. She has a chapter on plastic in the ocean. She has a chapter on air pollution that is not the climate change, but just the problem of smog and particulate matter in the air that can kill people. And she talks about a lot of this in historical context. Some of these problems have gotten a lot worse recently. The plastic in the ocean, for instance, is a very, very recent thing. Some things have been a problem for a very long time. Air pollution has been a problem for hundreds of years, and even before industrial society, really. When we were all burning wood to stay warm, burning wood is really bad for you. Burning wood releases so much particulate matter. It is genuinely bad for your health. And people used to die from it. And people still do die because we're burning stuff and putting it in the air. So she looks at the historical context of a lot of this stuff and talks about, are things getting better or things getting worse? And what technologies do we realistically have to make things get better in the future? How can we address climate change? How can we address pollution? How can we address deforestation? Should you panic or should you not panic? She has a chapter on basically farming and how to eat, whether or not we should eat less meat. The spoiler answer is yes, we should probably eat less meat, specifically less beef if you care about climate change and a lot of other things like deforestation, stuff like that. Beef is uniquely bad, I think. And she doesn't try to convince you to just go vegan, but she does try to convince you that you should eat less meat. But I found this book a really good breath of fresh air. It's a book that takes climate science and environmentalism seriously. And seriously, not just in the sense of it's a real problem, but that we need to actually focus on the practicalities of the data and the science behind the problem and the technology that will help us out of it. And she provides kind of an optimistic case that, look, these are problems we can fix. These are not world-ending problems. These are not the kind of things that are going to doom humanity. You are not going to die from them, but we need to take action. We can take a set of realistic actions that will fix the problem. So, it's a very dense book in terms of it's relatively easy to read, actually, but it's just filled with chart after chart, example after example, fact after fact, you're the kind of person who remembers a lot of facts, you're going to walk away with like, a new arsenal of like facts to throw into arguments. So I really enjoyed it. It's a book that is sorely needed to counter like doomist narratives about the climate and how we're all going to die and how this is all inevitable. None of that is true. Hannah Ritchie walks you through the realities of the problem and what we can do about it. I really enjoyed Not the End of the World by Hannah Ritchie. The number 2 book that I read this year, second best book that I read this year, is The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. The subtitle here is How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. This is something that I've kind of been following for a long time. I've written about it before, about how social media impacts young people. And so I was really excited to read this book, and I thought it was a genuinely very, very good book. The book essentially has 2 main arguments to make. It points out 2 big trends that it says are hurting kids these days. The first is that, number 1, kids spend more and more of their time, more time than ever before, looking at screens. iPad screens, smartphone screens especially. They are sucked into not just watching television, but the online, social media-based, internet-based stuff. And Jonathan Haidt makes an argument, this is not healthy. But while that's what gets all the attention, the book and the press around this book has almost all been about kids spend too much time on their smartphones. Smartphones are making all the kids, depressed and anxious and suicidal. And while I think that has some validity to it, the other part of the book I think is equally important, which is about the end of play, the end of kind of an independent play-based childhood. According to Jonathan Haidt, children need play. This is not a revolutionary thing, but children are not just, the little creatures that can sit silently in a box, in a white box, and learn mathematics and reading for 24 hours a day until they fall asleep. Children need to play. It's part of who they are, and it's part of their process of learning and expanding their minds. They need specifically free and unstructured play, not the kind of play that is organized for them where they're told exactly where to stand and what to go do, but play that allows them to explore and build and create things on their own without adult supervision. It's the kind of thing where children are always learning about the world, and they're having to constantly test their boundaries and discover new things. And that kind of unstructured play has a number of advantages. It forces kids to learn how to relate to others without some adult rushing in and telling them with the rules. It forces them to learn to cooperate and explore and build things or make up rules as they go, to figure out where a boundary is and figure out, can I push past this boundary or is this dangerous? It allows them to learn how to take risks, which, you don't want them jumping off a cliff, but moderate levels of risk are good for kids. They need scraped knees and bruises so that they can learn more about themselves. And according to Haidt, free play is not just good, it's vital. And kids get very little of it today. Kids are much less likely to meet up with their friends in person. They're less likely to physically explore their neighborhoods. This literally, like, how far is your kid allowed to walk without a parent has decreased over the years drastically, to the point where, like, some parents are now like, I won't let my kid walk 5 houses down. My kid can't walk 5 houses to the neighbors. I need to walk with them because otherwise they might not be safe. And, kids used to have so much freedom. And that's a really important part of the book as well. The book kind of rests on 2 pillars: that kids spend too much time with their face in a smartphone and reading apps and on social media, which is bad for them, but also that they are spending not enough time. At the same time, we've given them almost unlimited freedom on apps and the internet. A 13-year-old has unlimited access to the entire internet and social media, and that's really bad for a 13-year-old, potentially. according to Haidt. But at the same time, we've given them that kind of unlimited access to the internet. We've severely limited their access to the real world. They can't walk anywhere. They can't see friends. They're less likely than ever to spend time away from their parents. They're less likely than ever to have free, unstructured playtime. We're restricting them in the wrong ways and giving them freedom in the wrong ways. And that's why Haidt believes we've seen an epidemic of teen mental illness, that teen suicide rates are up and teen rates of depression are up. And that's kind of the central argument of the book. Now, I thought this book was really, really good and fairly convincing. There's been an enormous amount of discourse around the book. Is this really a problem? Is Jonathan Haidt exaggerating? Does he even have his numbers right? There's these big public debates that are happening, and some people are very pro-Haidt, and they say, oh, his evidence is super strong. Look at all these studies. Look at all this evidence. And some people say, no, look at this other study. He is interpreting this one wrong. And some of this debate gets into like a study versus study kind of thing, research versus research. I've got my favorite set of research studies. You've got your favorite set of research studies. What I will say about this whole debate is, I think that there is clearly something here. For people who want, there's a subset of people who want to say, nothing is wrong, all of this is fake, there is no teen mental health crisis, all of it is just an overreaction by insane boomers who want to hate technology, and they're always complaining about the kids these days, just like every generation does. I think that's wrong. There's clearly something here. I'm in the pro-Haidt camp, pro-Jonathan Haidt camp, where I think that the book is largely pretty good. I do think that, it's the situation is probably more nuanced than Haidt lets on. I've seen some good arguments, for instance, that this is often a mostly Anglophone phenomenon, that in the US and the UK and Australia and Canada and the English-speaking countries are mostly where you see the biggest impacts of this. And for some reason, Germany, France, Italy, whatever, other countries that are not English-speaking don't see as big impacts. And that's an interesting wrinkle here. There's obviously nuance in terms of it seems to hit teenage girls harder than it hits teenage boys. A lot of the statistics about depression and suicide and the things going wrong have a bigger impact on girls than boys. So there's nuance here, and I'm definitely fine discussing that nuance. But I think that when people try to say, look, there's just nothing here, there's just too much evidence for there to be nothing here. There's clearly something. Haidt also talks about kind of what to do about this. What do we do now that we realize that, okay, we've put too much on our kids in terms of smartphones and not enough in terms of real world play. And he makes a set of recommendations. Parents should not give kids smartphones before high school, and schools in general should be phone free. And that one, it seems like such common sense to me. There's absolutely no reason that a kid needs a smartphone in the middle of class. I would love for basically a bunch of schools, and schools are already doing this, but I would love for basically every school to say there are no phones on our campus. No smartphones allowed on our campus. If you bring it to campus, we're going to hold it for a week. If you bring it a second time, we're going to hold it for the rest of the year. Do not bring a smartphone to campus, because why would you need one? There's a lot of parents who are like, well, what if little Timmy's in a shooting and he needs... Look, if Timmy's in a shooting, you work downtown. Him calling you is not going to help anything. And that's a rare occurrence anyway. What are we talking about here? What we're really talking about is that you're anxious as a parent, and so you want to text Timmy every hour to see how class is going, and all you're doing is distracting him from learning. And teachers talk about this, that smartphones are bane in their classroom, and they can tell everyone's distracted all the time because of notifications, because of pulling out their phone, because they just got a text, because they're looking stuff up. It's just, there's no reason to have smartphones in schools. So Haidt makes a couple recommendations about we should be restricting social media and smartphones for young people. We should keep them out of schools, and that also young children especially need far, far more unsupervised play and more independence, that we should be, kids used to be independent much earlier of their parents. And now, thanks to the rise of helicopter parenting and, kind of separated suburbs where it's hard to explore, like, kids just aren't independent anymore. And we need more of that. And I find myself agreeing with most of that argument. We can argue about how something should be implemented, but those ideas in general are good ones. That we should not have smartphones in schools, that kids should be more independent. So I really enjoyed the book. I think it's valuable. I would recommend it to almost anyone. I sometimes am in this weird position where I am a non-parent and I am recommending a book about what to do with your kids to people who actually have kids. And I realize that's a very odd thing to do. Like, listen to me, who has no children, about how you should raise your children. But like, genuinely, this is a great book. You should at least read it and give it a shot. It's The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And that brings us to the very last book of this episode, and the best book I've read so far this year, and that is The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory by Tim Alberta. The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory is subtitled American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. And it's about the evangelical movement in America and how it turned political. This was an extremely good book. This was really, really good. I can't emphasize enough how much I liked this. Evangelical Christians are a powerful and polarizing force in American politics. And most people who listen to this podcast will not be evangelical Christians. I might have a very small minority of you listening who are evangelical. And if you are, you're certainly welcome here. But, most of us are not. And I think we understand that world very little. And it's important to understand it because it's such an influential part of American culture. Tim Alberta is somebody who was raised evangelical and is himself a practicing Christian. And he's the son of an evangelical pastor who grew up in this world, grew up very much a part of this world, still cares for this world, still has connections with this world. He wants Christianity in America to be the best version of itself. But the book is a fairly scathing critique of modern evangelical Christianity in America. And I think it hits a lot harder because it is not an outsider's critique. It is not some, limp-wristed, LGBT liberal from an Ivy League university, like whatever. Like, it's not somebody like that making some very woke critique of evangelicals, right? This is a guy, very right-leaning guy in some ways, or at least right-coded, in that he's a straight white, man who is an evangelical Christian, was raised in this world. But he criticizing it, I think coming from him, the criticisms have so much more weight and oomph behind them. They're much more powerful than if it was an outsider criticizing. Book is very sobering and dismaying in a sense. I would say, he has a lot of personal connections here, and so a lot of this is about his journey as well. But the book explores, how did evangelicalism in America turn from a religious movement to a political movement, essentially? Because in Alberta's mind, that's what's happened. This used to be a movement that was focused around Christ. It was focused around people and their personal relationship with Christ and their religious journey and how they tried to be better people and how they tried to build their church communities. And genuinely what he hopes religion should be, which is, the personal journey of someone's Christianity and how they try to be a better person, and how it turned from that into mega churches and Trump worship and basically political speeches from the pastor's pulpit, from the pulpit, just telling people to vote for Trump, telling people that Democrats want them to die, telling people that COVID-19 is fake, that evangelicalism has become not about Christ and not about religion. It has become about politics. The book is almost painfully nuanced, and it's knowledgeable of the history of evangelicalism. It's sensitive to, again, this is a guy, he's so empathetic and sensitive to the concerns of evangelicals. He is one, was one, whatever you want to say, but he can't stand what has become of his community, essentially. He can't stand what they've become. It's an extremely powerful book. I cannot praise it enough. It was eye-opening and revealing. It was written with empathy and understanding, and somebody who really wants the evangelical movement to succeed in the right way. And that makes its critique even more devastating, that he basically condemns them for what they have done and what they've turned themselves into. He does this from a number of examples, and I don't want to get too deep into each thing, but he talks about Liberty University and kind of the fear-driven culture there. He talks about the Southern Baptist Convention and how they have tried to reckon with what's going on. He talks about things going on at his father's church. His father has passed away now, and when his father did pass away, there was kind of a civil war between people who wanted a very kind of empathetic, mild pastor who just wanted to talk about your personal journey with Jesus, and kind of a Trump bomb-throwing pastor, essentially. His church, his childhood church split into camps, and a bunch of them left to go to a church that basically just turned into kind of the bomb-throwing version. Oh, these liberals want you to blah, blah, blah. Jesus is going to smite them all. Got to vote Trump, got to get in. Jesus would hate the Democrats. That kind of church is what a lot of people wanted. And Alberta's trying to figure out why, trying to think about how guns replaced Jesus, how Trump replaced Jesus. And he can't stand it. And you can feel how it breaks his heart that this is happening. At the same time, he deeply wants to understand why this is happening. And so he asks, why have you all turned into political actors? This has obviously happened. What's going on? And, people tell him that they feel, people tell them that they feel under siege. Christianity is under siege in America. And so we have to act like this, or if we're going to survive. But, Alberta's point is this is not working. And it's on a downward trend from 1980 to 90 to 2000 to 2010 to today. The number of Christians keeps going down, and the number of unaffiliated religious people in America keeps going up. And so, whatever the church is trying to do with their Jerry Falwell evangelical politics is not working. And Alberta is trying to steer them onto another path. I cannot praise this book enough. It is a phenomenal book. I would recommend it to absolutely anyone interested in politics in America. It is an incredibly important book to read, I think. The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory: American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism by Tim Alberta. So that's the book. That's the best book I've read this year. And that will conclude the episode. Thank you for listening. As always, we do this twice a year. I will recap all the books, that I read at the end of the year in December, and give you the best books that I read over the entirety of 2024. If you have any suggestions for what I should read, drop me a note. You can email me at mailbag@cnliberalism.org with any suggestions, thoughts, or questions for the podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.